Good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar on producer services in Nebraska. Is the state making progress? This webinar is being presented by the Bureau of Business Research, which is part of the Department of Economics within the College of Business here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. My name is Eric Thompson. I'm the Director of the Bureau of Business Research and also an Associate Professor of Economics. I want to thank you for joining us here today. And we're going to be going over a PowerPoint presentation in this webinar, tracking the progress of Nebraska in this key industry. And we'll also be answering some questions at the end of the PowerPoint based on any questions that you have. Before we get started, let me point out a few features of the webinar. First of all, there's a chat window, so you're able to chat with any of the participants in the webinar in that window. I would also note that the report that this webinar is based on, there's a link to that report that's in that chat room as well if you want to get a copy of the full report. We also have some other features. There's a question and answer window, so you can type in your questions at any point during the webinar. If something occurs to you during the presentation, go ahead and type in your question then, or you can wait to the end to type in your question. I'll answer questions at the end. Last thing I'd like to point out is we're going to have two poll questions of webinar participants during the webinar. So you'll see a little later those questions will come up, and please give your opinion, and then we'll see what the answer is a little bit later in the webinar presentation. So be curious to see how the audience does with those poll questions. Anyway, we'll get to that a little bit later. So with those points made, I'm going to go ahead and proceed with our webinar, Producer Services in Nebraska. Is the state making progress? First of all, we're going to talk about why we're going to focus on the producer services industry. As you'll see, it's a high-wage, high-growth job industry, which is the reason for our focus, but more on that in a minute. And we'll look at producer services trends in Nebraska, and then summarize what we found and talk about implications for the state. I'll begin with a definition of producer services. So producer services firms are firms that primarily provide services to the business community rather than individual households. So if you think about personal services, that's things like haircuts and so forth. Business services, professional services is really something very different. Producer services includes engineering services, sometimes provided to households, but mostly provided to private businesses. Accounting services, computer design services. There's also legal services, advertising services, consulting services, other types of information technology services. So these are really, in many ways, high-skill, almost often STEM-type businesses that provide services primarily to the business community rather than individual households. Very high-skill occupations and industries in many cases. In fact, when we talk about producer services, we're going to be focused on the professional, scientific, and technical services industry, which includes all of those types of services which I just mentioned. We're ready now for our first poll question, so go ahead and provide your answer when you're ready. A few slides down the road, we'll talk about the answer, but please provide your poll response. Does Nebraska have a higher or lower share of employment in producer services than the country as a whole? Is it higher, lower, or is it about the same? So go ahead and answer the question when you are ready. A little bit about producer services at the national level. Again, I argued a moment ago that producer services are interesting because it's a high-wage, high job growth industry, and you can see some evidence of that here. So we looked at the job growth in the United States over a recently completed decade, the year 2007, right before the Great Recession started. It started right at the end of that year, through 2016. And you can see, if you look at all industries, total employment only grew by 4.6% cumulatively. So that's not per year, that's all 10 years cumulatively. 4.6% job growth. So pretty anemic job growth during the period. But producer services grew by 15.9%. So around 1.5% per year of job growth. So very strong job growth, even in a period where the economy is weak, compared to manufacturing, which actually lost about 1% of its employment on an annual basis. So really a rapidly growing industry at the national level. Let's look at a little bit more about the wages of the producer services industry. So here's mean weekly wages in the United States. You can see all industries, the average weekly wage is $1,029 in 2016. So that translates to an annual income of about $50,000 a year, middle earning type jobs. You can see manufacturing pays a little better, about 20%, 25% above the all industry average. But producer services pays much better still, 75% nearly above the all industry average. So not only are producer services jobs growing rapidly, they're also very high wage jobs. So it's an interesting industry to target and focus on. How are we doing in the state of Nebraska? So there's your answer to the poll question. Is the share of employment in producer services higher in Nebraska or the United States? If I look at the poll responses, I see we're kind of split. With about half of people saying higher in Nebraska or about the same, and a little over half saying lower, and it was the lower was the correct answer. Nebraska is actually significantly lower, with just 4.3% of our employment in producer services compared to 6.2% nationwide. So to some extent in Nebraska, we are missing out on opportunities in this rapidly growing high wage industry. Let's talk a little bit more about trends in this sector in the state of Nebraska. These were 2016 figures I showed you, 4.3% of employment in Nebraska, 6.2% of employment in the United States. Well, what did we find if you look at more detail at specific types of producer services? So if you focus on computer system design and related services, you can see the U.S. has about 1.4% of its employment, Nebraska only about 1.1%. So Nebraska's behind about 30% there. If you look at architectural and engineering services, again, a lot of great firms in architecture and engineering in Nebraska, but the share of employment is just 0.6% here compared to about 1% nationally. Accounting and bookkeeping, once again, a lot of great firms in Nebraska, a lot of great computer systems design firms in Nebraska as well. But the share of employment in that sector is just a little bit less in Nebraska, about 25-30% less than it is nationwide. And then we lump the rest of the components of producer services, that professional, scientific, and technical services industry. We lump them together because that data is not broken out for Nebraska. So if you look at legal services, specialized design services, all the other scientific research and development, again, we have a lot of great businesses in Nebraska, a lot going on, 2.11% of our employment in these other producer services industries. But again, that's less than the nation where it's a full 3%. So kind of across the board, Nebraska's got a little less going on in this key high wage, rapid growth sector. Another natural question is Nebraska catching up? And we'll get to that in a minute, but I want to go ahead and ask the second poll question now. We saw that Nebraska was a bit behind. Could that be related to city size? In other words, Nebraska doesn't have a truly large metropolitan area. We've got a lot of people living in non-metropolitan areas, rural areas in our state. Does city size play a role in the concentration of producer services, and can that explain why Nebraska is a little bit behind in this key industry? So that's the poll question. Go ahead and answer when you feel ready. We'll reveal the answer a few slides down the road. So the more pressing question, is Nebraska catching up? So we're behind 4.3% to 6.2%, But it could be that we're gaining on the rest of the country, that the gap used to be larger and Nebraska's closing the gap. What's happened in recent years? Well, we have some data on that as well. If you look at that same 2007 to 2016 period, you see that there was a lot of job growth in producer services in Nebraska, almost 9% cumulatively, almost 1% per year. That's great, but if you recall, it's a little bit higher nationally. And this is even despite the fact that all industry job growth was a little stronger, 5.6% in Nebraska versus 4.5% nationwide. So our employment was growing faster in Nebraska, but the growth rate of producer services, while solid, while impressive, was slower than we saw nationally. Here's a summary of that. 2007 to 2016, nearly 16% growth in the United States, just 8.9% in Nebraska. Also, in recent years, Nebraska hasn't done as well, about 12.5% growth cumulatively from 2012 to 2016. Most of that growth occurred after the U.S. economy started recovering from the Great Recession. But in Nebraska, last 4 years, cumulative growth has been just 2.3%. So the state, if anything, is falling a little bit further behind in this key sector. Okay, what can we say about city size and producer services? Well, producer services are exportable services. So I talked earlier about personal services, through the contrast between producer services for business and personal services for people and households. A lot of personal services are not exportable. In other words, the barbershop's going to serve exclusively a local market. However, producer services often can serve a much wider market, a multi-state market, a national market, even an international market. Think about an accounting firm. Many accounting firms will have clients scattered throughout a state or even in multiple states. Certainly, information technology firms can have some local clients, but also a lot of clients from outside of the area. So there's a potential to have a concentration of producer services in certain cities. And there can be a big advantage for larger cities in producer services. There's a big local market for those services that allows firms to grow, to form. It allows firms to grow. As firms grow to a medium or large size just to serve the local market, then they have a better capacity to compete in the national economy as well, providing their services to businesses in other states, other parts of the country. So there's actually a significant advantage for producer services in larger cities. I see that our poll respondents were on to that answer. About almost 90% correctly said that the concentration of producer services rises with city size, and with about the remaining 12 to 13% indicating no influence. There is evidence, pretty good evidence, that it does actually increase with city size. Let's look at some of that evidence. We're going to look at three groups: a larger metropolitan area like Omaha. It's not a huge metropolitan area, but it's certainly a larger metropolitan area. A mid-sized metropolitan area like Lincoln, and a smaller metropolitan area like Grand Island, Nebraska. So if we compare each of these Nebraska metropolitan areas with their peers from the middle part of the country, how do they stack up? Well, here we have a set of larger metropolitan areas from the middle part of the country, some larger than Omaha, like Kansas City, some smaller, like Colorado Springs or Boise, a little bit smaller. Milwaukee larger, Louisville about the same size. So a good group of peers. And you can see here the share of employment in producer services in each of these metropolitan areas. Omaha is a little bit middle of the pack, maybe a little bit behind. If you looked at the average for these 8 metropolitan areas, it'd be about 6.2% of the employment in producer services. Omaha is a little bit behind that at 5.3%. But we can say Omaha is doing reasonably well compared to his peers, but perhaps not leading the pack. Let's look at Lincoln. Comparing Lincoln to Des Moines, Lexington, Kentucky, another city with a big university, similar size to Lincoln. a little bit bigger than the Lincoln metropolitan area, but also a major state university and quite near its state capital. Fargo, North Dakota, Lincoln's a little bigger. Lansing, again, state capital, big university. That area is a little bit larger than Lincoln, but these are good peer comparisons. You can see that Lincoln is about middle of the pack. Again, maybe a little bit behind, but quite close to the middle of the pack in its peers. So what we're starting to see here is it does seem like part of the reason Nebraska lags in producer services is it tends to have mid-sized and it doesn't have very large cities where the industry is concentrated. It tends to have larger but not very large metropolitan areas like Omaha, middle-sized metropolitan area like Lincoln. That's explaining some of the reason for and in a lot of non-metropolitan areas where producer services are less common. If we finally look at Grand Island, our new metropolitan area here in Nebraska, just crossed the threshold a few years back to be classified a metropolitan area. You can see that it's behind its peers in terms of the concentration of employment in the producer services industry. Lastly, I'd like to show you the results for some of the other micropolitan areas around Nebraska. Micropolitan areas are cities that are substantial size but smaller than metropolitan areas. A metropolitan area has to have a central city of at least 50,000. A micropolitan area has a central place between 10,000 and 50,000. So you can see Kearney, North Platte, Norfolk, Scottsbluff, Hastings, Columbus, all the way to Fremont are some of the many of the micropolitan areas in the state of Nebraska. And you can see that these areas tend to have a similar share of employment as we found in Grand Island, which again had just recently made the transition from a micropolitan area to a metropolitan classification. Some interesting results here. If you look at those micropolitan areas with a larger share of employment in producer services, we see Kearney, we see North Platte, we see Scottsbluff. And of course, all of these micropolitan areas are in the western part of Nebraska. So it may suggest that when you're in the western part of the state, you're farther from Omaha and Lincoln, you're less likely to lose in competition to larger firms in Omaha and Lincoln, and you're maybe able to keep more of that producer services employment at home versus Fremont, right adjacent to the Omaha metropolitan area, Beatrice, right adjacent to the Lincoln metropolitan area. These micropolitan areas seem to specialize a lot less in producer services. Again, maybe those businesses are in the nearby metropolitan area. Okay, so by way of summary, we see that Omaha and Lincoln, both of those metropolitan areas are above the state average. In other words, they have 5.3 and 4.6% of employment in producer services, which is above the state average of 4.3%. Although I'll note neither one of them is at the U.S. average of 6.2%. Both are consistent with their peers, although they're certainly not leading the pack relative to their peers in terms of producer services employment. So I think this, and then you saw lower shares in Grand Island and most micropolitan area with that interesting result that the micropolitan areas in western Nebraska seem to do relatively well. So I think what this suggests, taken together, is that yes, because we're a more rural state, we have more people living in non-metropolitan areas, living in in particular in micropolitan areas. Our cities are small and mid-sized. Omaha being a larger city, but not a very large city. We just don't have the types of metropolitan areas that would tend to concentrate in producer services. So that might be part of the reason that we're behind. On the other hand, we're not really leading our peers. We could be the top ranked among our peers in terms of the share of employment in producer services, but we're not. We're kind of average, even for cities of a similar size. And as you saw, we're not really gaining. Why is Nebraska falling further behind with the share of employment in producer services? So it's not just a matter of fate. It's perhaps something we could work on and do better, despite the fact that we have, mid-sized and smaller cities and a larger non-metropolitan population. So what could be done? I think there's a number of options. Obviously, producer services, those high-wage, high skill industries, a lot of high skill, high wage workers. If we could train more STEM workers in our state, already doing a lot of that, but if we could do even more, perhaps that would help us grow those industries. They wouldn't be lacking workers. That wouldn't be holding them back, as it may in some cases. And obviously, computer and mathematical workers, people who can work in the information technology sector, might be especially important. Another thing, a lot of producer services firms are small and mid-sized, privately owned businesses. So if we could do tax reform to lower the rates on our small business owners, that might be a benefit as well. And finally, if we could do things to increase the quality of life in our state, particularly things that appeal to college-educated workers that are needed in producer services industries, that would be another way to help grow the industry in the state. Obviously, to be consistent with that other goal of tax reform, some of this amenity building would have to be done through the private sector or local government rather than state government. Okay, well, those were the main points we wanted to make about the producer services sector in Nebraska. The Bureau of Business Research is committed to continue to track the evolution of this important industry in our state's economy. Hopefully we'll see Nebraska, we do on a yearly basis, a lot of good things happening in producer services, a lot of great businesses in the state. But hopefully we'll see Nebraska closing that gap with the nation and benefiting even more from this high wage, high growth industry. So thank you for participating in our webinar today. We'd be happy to answer any questions that people have had or asked. While we're looking for those questions, let me just mention a few things. Please connect with the Bureau of Business Research. You can find us on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Twitter. We produce several reports, sometimes more, about the Nebraska economy every month. If you'd like to be on our e-newsletter list, receive an email with a link to those reports as they come out, please send us your preferred email address to bbr@unl.edu. And if we've had any questions, I would be happy to answer them now. Not seeing any questions. I'm going to go ahead and sign off. But again, thank you all for participating in our webinar. And we look forward to seeing you next month when we present a webinar showing the results of our most recent forecast for the Nebraska economy, which will cover the years 2018, 2019, and 2020.